Hello, church. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. If you get that reference, 10 points to you. If not, just come find me sometime at church and I'll explain it to you. But just because I don't know when you're watching this, I want to make sure I cover all my bases. Welcome to Class 7, I believe, of Short Stories by Jesus. Today I'll be covering Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, which is the story of the vineyards. The story of the laborers in the vineyard, In full transparency, when I was going through and researching this and just really diving into the passage, I found a really great article that essentially does exactly what I was going to do and break it down verse by verse and really go through and explain it. And the guy did a much better job than what I could have possibly imagined doing, and so I'm actually going to steal the majority of my lesson this today from him, and so I just want to give him the credit for it. But I will be bringing up the back end and ending it with my thoughts on the conclusion and just some practical takeaways and potentially, what does this look like in our life. But before we get started, it talks about how, when the Bible was written, all these chapters and verses weren't here, and so we're actually going to start in Matthew 19 verse 16. So we're going to add almost half a chapter onto this, and so I'm going to read through Matthew 19 verses 16 through Matthew 20 verses 16. Alright, and so we'll go ahead and start there again. Matthew 19 verse 16. And behold, a man came to him, saying, Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And he said to him, Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments. He said to him, Which ones? And Jesus said, You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, All these I have kept. What do I still lack? Jesus said to him, If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And Jesus said to his disciples, Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished, saying, Who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Alright, so there's kind of a little break. Now think of this next section as kind of section 2 real quick of the story. Right, still the same context, but if you're thinking through it. Verse 27 of Matthew 19. Then Peter said in reply, See, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? And Jesus said to them, Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father, or mother, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, will receive 100-fold, and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. That's going to be a key verse. Alright, so I'm going to read that one again, verse 30. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. And so starting in verse 20, our short story for today. Chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for the vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others staying idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And then about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, Why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, Because no one has hired us. And he said to them, You go into the vineyard, and when evening came, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to the foreman, Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired, fun fact, in accounting, we call that LIFO, last in, first out. So just a little fun accounting tip for you right there. Sorry. All right. Chapter 20, verse 8. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each one of them received a denarius. Now when those who hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden all day in the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I do you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last. All right, so let's dive in, first hitting that context piece. He essentially sets the stage. It sets the stage based on an interaction that Jesus had with the rich young ruler, right? And so in 19:16 through 22, he asked, good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus told him to sell his possessions, give to the poor, and the man went away sorrowful, right? Jesus essentially saying, give everything up and come follow me. And so then Peter, observing this exchange, right? So you got the apostles there just watching him interact. Peter, observing this exchange between this man and Jesus, noted that the disciples have given everything to follow Jesus. And we see that in verse 27. All right, and so he asks, well, what's their reward? And Jesus answers generously to the 12. And he says, y'all will sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. But then he goes on and says, but the rewards aren't limited just to y'all, right? Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children for my name's sake will receive 100 times, right? 100 times what the apostles are getting, and will inherit eternal life. And so this will not diminish the rewards for the 12, but it extends that reward to the other people who are also deserving. And so you got to think it must come as a surprise for the 12 to hear that, thinking that, we're the ones walking with Jesus, being with Jesus, going through it day in, day out, and others get to share in this that might not have had a long chance to. And so Peter, again, verse 27 asks, what then will we have? This is not like the last we will hear. This is not the last we'll hear of the apostles' ambitions, right? You remember the request of James and John's mother, right, coming and saying, hey, can you give my 2 sons that special seating with you whenever your kingdom comes, right? Again, they're still thinking kind of that earthly kingdom, right? And so they have this type of ambition of this type of promotion and competition. I'm trying to get to that next spot within the church working for Jesus, right? That very worldly mentality, right, of like essentially climbing the ladder and thinking that same thing, because especially back then, positions of honor were everything almost. And so we kind of see that unfolding here between the apostles. But Jesus turns this ambition topsy-turvy, right? He strips away the notion that we must earn our way into heaven, and he strips the notion that our heavenly rewards will be proportionate to our Christian service, which is huge, right? Because we think of fairness and equality today and stuff like that, and all the fights of that is that the idea that, you basically get what you give, and that's kind of our mentality, which we go. But again, Jesus flips that away, and he strips away the notion of competing with other Christians and other saints for heavenly rewards, and he leaves us wholly dependent on the generosity and on the mercy of God, who is eager and willing to surprise us with an undeserved gift, right? And so he's going to lavish that on us with joy, and it's a reward that we can't even possibly conceive of. But this idea of sharing it, might give us a little bit of heartache. And so whenever Peter heard this, whenever Peter asked this was Jesus' response to Peter on, what shall we get? Because I feel like he could see, he could tell that they're confused, and there's probably like some furrowed brows going on, right? And so again, when he warns them, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. Right, and so he starts off the parable with this, and again, this is where he then dives into it, right? And so if you think about whenever Peter hears this, or whenever they hear this, it's a wonderful promise for those who are last, but for those who are first, you're just like, what in the world? Like, I got to be last now? Like, that doesn't make any sense, and it seems like it's not fair, right? And so you got someone like Peter, who was married, who had a job, everything, who left everything to follow Jesus. And so you think if he must have heard this parable, the frustration that it had, because it implied that the rewards that he's going to get and that the apostles are going to get, that they'll receive, that lesser disciples, I use quotations on lesser, will also receive those rewards. And it had to offend Peter. And honestly, for us worldly folks here, especially when we're walking in the world and we don't have that spiritual mindset, it offends us too, that sense of justice. Like, I worked more than this person, I put in more, I do this, I should get more, right? If you're in the gym and you're training harder than the other person and you're putting in more work, you should expect to see more results than that other person. It's not the same way in the kingdom of heaven. And so we see, as we start to dive in, that God's grace is ultimate and for everyone. And we'll bring out some fun economic aspects of it. But as the article dives in and starts breaking down this story, we'll start seeing this idea of true grace and what it means, right? Because our worldly self, we don't want to be on par. We want to be on top. We want to, I put in this work, this is what I should get, right? But God, he gives out mercy and justice, and he rewards it fairly, right? And his fairness might not necessarily be who worked the longest, but his fairness is you don't deserve it at all, so here it is. All right, and so as we get into this, we'll go through these 16 verses in chapter 20, and then we'll dive into some takeaways. And so again, reading verses 1 through 7. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man who was the master of a household, who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he agreed with the laborers for denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. He went out about that third hour and saw others standing in the marketplace. To them he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give to you. So they went their way. And again he went about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle. He said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. And he said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and you will receive what is right. So the parable starts off wonderfully well, right? It's a landowner. He goes out early in the morning. He finds laborers for his vineyard. Even though he might have a manager, someone to do all this for him, like he's the one that goes out to the marketplace, right? He's putting that on him, and he's going out and finding those workers, right? And so in verse 2, he hires those who are available for the work, right? And so after agreeing to their, securing their agreement to a fair wage, right, which is about a day's worth of pay, right? So think about how much, you make a year, divide it by 250 working days or so, and that's how much money you potentially be talking about, right? And so they agreed 1 day's pay for a full day's work. Makes sense, fair, just right. The worldly mindset makes sense, it's fair. And then it talks about how he went out about the 3rd hour, right? So 3rd hour, you can think of 9 a.m., right? Which is technically, how the Jews saw their time and the way they recorded their time and different things like that. So when you hear 3rd hour, think 9 a.m. And so then he also makes additional trips at the 6th and 9th hour. So then you can think noon at 3. All right. So he went out early in the morning, right at 9. Then he goes back again at noon. Then he goes back again at 3. And then his final trip on the 11th hour is at 5. All right. So he's going throughout each of the day. He must have a really big yard. And so then verse 4, right, to them he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give to you. So they went their way. And so, you can either have this idea of there's this urgency, because with the first group, he told them what he was going to pay. I'm going to give you X amount, right? But the next 3 groups, he didn't tell them what he was going to pay them. These next 2, he tells them, I'm going to pay you what is right. Right? And so, their mindset might be, okay, I'm just going to get a quarter or whatever a day. But they went ahead and went. Right, he does not specify what he's going to pay these workers. And then again, when he went and so again, he did that 6th and 9th hour, and then on the 11th hour, he went out and found more people, right? And this is where we get the idea that 11th hour, right? The last minute, very last second, right? Very late in the game, or very late, they did it in the 11th hour. They barely got by at the skin of their teeth, right? Night's coming, and he's still got work to do, right? He's still got work to do. He still needs that help, right? And as you see, he asked them, why are you sitting here idle? And they said, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and you will receive whatever is right. Some scholars speculate that the landowner is trying to speed the harvest to prevent spoilage. There's no mention in the text, but we can guess that of his motives might be perhaps just to intervene in his mind eyes, because he sees, maybe these people, children, going without food or something like that. But he wants to hire these people, even though there's just a little bit of time left, right? He wants to give them that opportunity, right? And so again, those hired early, they have a clear contract, denarius day of wage, boom. For those hired at 9, noon, and 3 o'clock, right, the landowner promises he'll pay what's right. And then for this fourth group, he doesn't mention money at all, right? If we go to that verse, again, it's verse 7, he doesn't mention all. They said to him, because no one is hired, and he said to them, you go into the vineyard too. That's all he says. There's nothing about what you're going to get paid, what you're going to get to do, or anything like that. So these people are going in without any type of contract, without any expectation of this type of reward. But there is a reward, and we see that in the next few verses. So verses 8 through 12, right? And so when evening had come, right, so the day is getting dark, and you got to pay what you owe, and so he's required to pay the laborers, right? And he said, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning from the first to the last, right? And so as Jesus said, the last will be first, and the first will be last. He'll soon repeat it here coming up. And in the parable, this is when we actually see it, right? This is when they can actually physically visualize it, right? So the workers who were hired late, they come in and they get paid first. And all the day workers who were there at the very beginning, they get paid last. Again, there's fun accounting topics, stuff like that. And it's normal for stuff like that to be done. All right, and so when those who were hired at the 11th hour came, they each received a denarius. Right, so picture it, you come and you work for an hour, but you get paid for the whole day. I'm ecstatic. I didn't even think I was going to get paid, and here I am, I'm getting a whole day's worth of work. Right, I thought I wasn't going to have anything. I get to go work. I thought, maybe get a little bit. I get a whole day's worth of money. Right, the grace, the blessings, the thankfulness you got to have for that. And so as we dive in a little bit deeper, these are the 1 hour workers, right? Those who repented, on their deathbeds, right? Those who battled addictions their whole lives, and they're coming at 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. People who have lived just rough lives and have been in that sinful life, right? You think of the prodigal son who went out and left and was lost. But these are people who went out and came back. These are those people who were hired that 11th hour, right? God calls them to a greater calling, and here's the reward, that denarius, right? We had no complaints from them or from all the other workers too, who were hired at 3 p.m. at noon. None of them came. And so as he pushes forward, he says, when the first came, they supposed they had received more, and likewise they each received a denarius, right? That idea is like, oh, these people are getting a denarius, but now if they're getting a denarius, and let's see, I worked this many more hours than them, then I might get this, right? And that expectation of, because I worked this much, right? It's like they forgot I was offered to come work, right? And we signed that contract, right? And so when their time comes, all the day workers also received a denarius, and at that point they start complaining. And the complaint is not that they should receive more money, but here's the complaint in verse 12. These last have spent 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us. You can hear kind of the pridefulness, the bitterness, right? You have made them equal to us, who have borne the scorching heat, right? We got the pain, we got the toughness, we did a lot of that work, and you made them equal to us. What is that? Right, the early risers competed hard in the competitive world, and they expected to end up ahead of those who didn't. Right, they get in line and they got to work early, and they were in the heat of the day. Right, and to them, it's not fair. Right, and this is the truth that the parable unveils, that a lot of Jewish readers would need to hear, because it unveils a truth that Peter and the other apostles needed to hear as well, right? It unveils a truth that we need to hear as Christians, and that truth is that God calls us to give ourselves unreservedly to God's service and to trust God for our reward, and that's it, right? He calls us to trust Him, that He's going to give us a reward, and that reward is beyond measure. It's not looking at other people's rewards, but the reward that He gives us. And that God is certain to be more generous than what we deserve. And I think that's the key point, is that He's more generous than what we deserve. Right? And so probably more generous than we can even imagine. And so while those who work so hard want to show God mercy to those less deserving, we also want God to reward our good service with a special dial of blessing, right? We just want a little bit more because we put in a little bit more work. right? And so maybe Jesus' story is fairer than it seems at first blush, because we assume that it's a better deal to work 1 hour for a full day's wages than to work the whole day for the same amount, right? This idea that, oh, they only had to work an hour, but they still got the same reward. But it's like, I got the opportunity to live for Jesus my entire life, no matter how hard it was. You think Paul would give up any of those hours, any of those days that he lived living for Jesus for a million years of living without Jesus? Like, no way. He would never give that up. Him living for Jesus was the most joyful experience he's ever had. And that's our mentality we got to have. And so we must ask ourselves, is it better to live most of one's life without Christ, without faith, without prayer, hope, without peace, and pay the cost of discipleship only in our last days? Or is it better to have a life fully lived serving Christ with the scorching heat? With the sun, you're going to get a great tan anyways. So, it works out, right? And so, this opportunity that we get to work our lives for that, and we get to share that these other people who were only here for an hour, they also get the reward, right? And we want them to have the reward. We want them to have that. But we can't be thinking, well, they got the same thing I got. That's not fair, because that's not how Jesus works. Right? The ultimate reward of faithful discipleship is eternal life, and there is no scarcity, right? The idea of scarcity, it's a fun economic term. It's the reason what causes our prices, right? The reason why a beach house is so expensive is because if everyone could afford one, there's not enough. There's only so much beach on the earth, right? So not everyone can have a beach house, right? So you have to increase the price of what it is, because eventually it's going to run out. God's grace never runs out, right? And if we go in with that mentality that His grace never runs out, we have nothing to fear. It's like, you can give them all you want, God, because I know you got enough for me, and that it's always going to be there, right? And that's where the idea of faith comes in, the idea that we need to go out and save all these people who might be coming in at the last hour, right? No one's too old, no one's too lost, to try to bring them to Christ and for them to experience that grace, because there's work to be done. And no matter if it's, still 9 a.m. in God's eyes, or if it's, 10:59 and it's getting close to that 11th hour, we still got to work, and He's still going to be bringing people to the kingdom to work, right? And our rewards are going to be the same. And then real quick at the very end, in 13 through 15, they get upset, and he said, and the owner, this is the master, he says, "Friend, I do no wrong," right? He calls them friends when they're complaining to him. He's still like friends, so that while they might be ungrateful, he doesn't call them out for that, right? He shows grace to the latecomers, and now he's even showing grace to the older people who are getting mad at him. He said, "Didn't you agree with me for a denarius?" Right? They contracted the usual wage, and the landowner did not shortchange them any bit. We are not going to be shortchanged by God when He promises us a reward of eternal life. We're not going to be shortchanged. What He promises, He's going to give us, right? And He paid them fully in accordance with their agreement. And the landowner's generosity to the latecomers has not taken a penny out of the pockets of the all-day workers, right? Those people that worked all day, they didn't lose a single penny because He was able to give a full day's wage to the people. And so He says, "Take what is yours and go your way. It is my desire to give to this last as much as to you." There is no harsh judgment here, only grace. The landowner does not punish the only workers for complaining, but acknowledges that the denarius they received is their property. They are free to take it and to leave, but they are not free to dictate what the landowner will do with the rest of his money. I love that idea. As a pure capitalist or whatever it is, it's my money. I get to decide what to do with it. Right? We as Christians know that it's not our money. But this idea that I'm going to go into a business and tell them, you can't sell this, you shouldn't sell this because I don't agree with it, or it's not right? It's that person's stuff. They can give, he can give as much as he wants, right? It's God's grace. He can give it to whomever He wants to, and whoever wants to use it, right? And they struggle with this with the Gentiles, giving grace and the Spirit to the Gentiles, right? He gives it to all who He wills. And then the landowner asks, closing it up, "Isn't it lawful for me to do what I want to do with what I own, or is your eye evil because I'm good?" And these two questions go to the heart of this parable, right? The question is, is your eye evil because I'm good? And He says, "Are you jealous because I have been generous?" Essentially is what He's saying. Are you jealous because I have been generous? Right? And the landowner asks, and the answers are obvious. First, the landowner is clearly allowed to do what he wants to do with his money. And second, the all-day workers are jealous. They paid the price to get ahead. They got up early at the crack of dawn. They worked in the heat of the day. They did it all for this reward. However, they all ended up the same, right? And so this idea that they were playing by the world's rules, but the landowner was playing by the kingdom's rules. And playing by the kingdom's rules, we're all going to win, right? Because we're all on the same page. And then he comes back and he finishes again. So again, the last will be first and the first last. For many are called, but few are chosen. And so he ends it the way he begins it, with the great reversal. And who are the first and who are the last? It's those who, the first are those who, I think of like me being born into the church and growing up, being in church every single day and stuff like that. And the last might be, those people on the streets, right? Drug dealers, prostitutes, people who have just gone their whole life living for money, living for other things, and then somehow, some way, God called them to this grace that I've experienced my whole life. And it's my job to rejoice at that, right? Because in no way does that affect my grace and my reward that He's going to give me, and it's just going to make me happier because I have more brothers and sisters to share it with. And so that's the closing of the article, and just a quick few thoughts. I know I'm getting close to my time here. And so how does this apply for us today? The first one is we need to rejoice in God's grace to others, just like I said, right? No way am I ever going to not tear up at someone getting baptized or someone committing their life to Jesus, because to me, that is the greatest thing that could ever happen. And so us rejoicing in God's grace to other people. And so when I was growing up, I struggled with that so hard. I saw myself as the brother in the prodigal son, right? How dare he, he spent all your money and you're throwing him this party. That's not fair, right? That's worldly thinking. We got to be about the kingdom mindset and this idea that God's grace is unlimited and that He gives it to who He wills. And it's our job to rejoice in that and to trust that His grace is never going to run out. And it's the idea that we need to find more joy in the giver of the reward than the reward itself. Right? Growing up, it was always, I wanted to serve God because I was scared to go to hell. And then it's kind of shifted to, man, I want that reward. And now it's like, I just want to be with God. Right? And so it's like my mind shifted as I started maturing. And it's like, if you gave me a gift and my mom gave me the exact same gift, it's probably going to mean a little bit more from my mom just because I have that relationship, right? And so sometimes it is the gift that makes a really big difference, but for me, it's the person who gives that gift because I have that relationship, right? And so we need to find more joy in the giver than the reward than the reward itself. And we never need to forget that we deserve death. That reward we're getting is not done because of what, right? It's not done because of our works. Those people went and worked all day in that, right? They didn't deserve that because they were just sitting on. They weren't hired already, right? They weren't servants or whatever already. They had to be called to come do that, right? We are called to this grace. So this reward we're getting isn't even on us, right? So even if we got a tenth of the reward we're supposed to get, that's 100% more than we should have get, because what we should get is zero, right? And so this idea that we deserve death, and if you ever lose that perspective, you're going to start thinking that you deserve more from God than what you're getting. Right. At the end of the day, we deserve death. So all we get from Him is grace and mercy, and that is truly enough to cover everything else. Because, again, we were getting death. We were getting nothing. And the last one is that His grace will never run out. Right? There's no beachfront property that you got to pay a ton of money for. Right? His grace is unlimited and eternal, and it will never go away. And so I hope as you go through and read this, I'm happy to share the link as well to this article if you want to read it a little bit more and more in depth. But it's a really great study to get to go through and do, and really this idea of just how awesome God's grace is, and for us to rejoice at the fact that those who were saved on their deathbed, who called upon the name of the Lord, will receive the exact same reward that we receive, because God's grace is just that awesome. Man, I love y'all. I hope y'all have an awesome week. It's Sunday night for me, and so I'm ready to crush the week. Hope you have a great Monday, and we're going to win the day for Jesus, and I pray that you glorify Him in all that you do. Thank you. Bye.